Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight. My name is Juliana Ranches. I'm assistant professor and beef extension specialist with Oregon State University. This is our last evening together. And I have to say it's been a pleasure to be organizing this webinar series. We had a very good the first 2 nights were very good. I think we learned a lot. And I'm very excited for tonight. As you know, the main goal of this series is to provide information and discuss about wildfires with focus on preparedness prior to wildfire season, and to learn and understand how to better care for livestock during after wildfires or during smoke exposure. So this is the second edition of this webinar series, and this series is a part of a larger project that is USDA funded. I'm going to share a little bit of the research portion of this project today. And so actually for tonight is Dr. Jenifer Cruickshank and myself sharing a little bit on beef research update and also how to care for livestock during wildfire and smoke exposure. As you know by now, if you have any questions, we're going to answer those questions at the end of the webinar. So you can add your questions to the Q&A box, and we'll get to those questions at the end. Okay, so without any more conversation, I think I'll go ahead and start my portion of the presentation. So as I said, Dr. Jenifer Cruickshank and myself will be sharing the webinar tonight. I'll give a brief introduction on the fire and smoke situation, and then I'll jump into our research update. And then Jenifer will cover a little bit on livestock preparedness and also caring for animals during smoke exposure. Okay, so with that, hopefully you guys are seeing my slides okay. As a brief presentation overview, I'm going to talk a little bit about the fire records and air quality and smoke, and then we're going to jump into preparedness for fire and caring for livestock during fire smoke. Very briefly on fire, we know the risk of wildfires that pose to people and environment is increasing over time, and there's a number of factors, but one of those factors is also climate change. And unfortunately, there's not a lot we can do to reduce the risks of fire, but there's a lot we can do to manage fires, or the likelihood of having fires. So if you did miss last night webinar with Dr. Katie Wolsting, I highly encourage you to watch the recordings later that will be posted online later. She shared quite a bit of information on how to prepare for the fire season and how to manage fire views. I thought it was a very good talk that gave us a very good overview on preparing for that season. So if you missed that, it's going to be posted online. So I really recommend you to check that out. So thinking about fires over the years, I have here just as a illustration the number of fires we've seen over the last year. So this is the fire records by the National Interagency Fire Center. And I think all why I decided to start working with wildfire and smoke was when I started my position here at OSU, which was in 2020. And as we can see here, 2020 was actually a record-breaking year for fires. Largest number of fires, largest number of acres being burned, the ratio acre by fire too. So over the years, last years, we've been above the average, the national average for those numbers. Although last year we had a little bit mild, not so bad year in terms of fire numbers. But as we can see here over the years, whenever we have a year that's not too bad, we tend to have accumulation of biomass, and the subsequent year sometimes happens to be a little bit more catastrophic. So I think preparing this year for the wildfire season is very important, and we need to be ready for what's coming this year. Right now, when we look at fire records, we have a total of 8 incidents of large fires. And when we mean large fires, those are defined as fires that are more than 100 acres if we're talking about timber fuel, or more than 300 acres if we're talking about grass fuel models. So we have 8 of those nationally going on right now, but we have way more fires going on than that since the beginning of the year, more than 16,000 incidents so far. And we have about 50,000 acres burning at the moment. Records are building up, and the fire season haven't really started yet. So let's see what we're gonna, where we're gonna go this year, where we're gonna get to. But I think with these numbers, it's really important to be prepared for the upcoming season. And with fires, you guys know we're very interested in smoke. So with fires, although not everybody is affected by the fires, a large population can be affected by the smoke. The smoke has the ability to disperse over very long land, like cross land. So last year we saw, I mean, this is from 2020, I'm sorry, but here's a good example of wildfires from Oregon and California that carry over, like air carry over the smoke from those fires to New York. So very smoky days on that in the other side of the country. So showing the ability of ability of the air to carry that smoke to a very, very distance location, right? Similarly, last year we also saw very intensive fires in Canada that brought smoke over to New York. So I really like this picture from June last year, I'm sorry, where the Empire State Building was covered by smoke from the Canadian wildfires. And as I was putting this presentation together, I had for last year's presentation, this slide that show the smoke dispersion. So specifically here, PM 2.5 over the US in June 2013, when all the Canadian wildfires were going on. So as you can see, we have very poor air quality almost over the entire nation. June last year. And in this other side here, we have the air quality for June 2014, which is a little bit, it's quite a bit better than if we compare to last year. There's still fires going on in Canada, and I believe there's some fires going on in Mexico that are bringing smoke inland, but nothing compared to what we were seeing June last year. So when we think about smoke and air quality, so smoke from wildfires is really complex. It can be a mixture of very different products. So it really depends on the fire behavior, the vegetation type that's burned, the season, the burning conditions, available fuel. There's multiple variables that can change the characteristics of that smoke. But what we're really concerned and have major interest, it's particular matter 2.5, which is a mixture of solid and liquid droplets that's in the air, and then it's part of that smoke product. So here, just as an illustration, we have a fine beach sand and a hair strand, human hair strand. And as we can see, then we have around this hair what is called PM10, which is almost like dust and pollen size. And then within, like right on top of the PM10, I'm sorry, we have PM2.5, which is from combustion particles, organic compounds, and metals. So it's a very, very, very tiny particle that we are mostly concerned about when we think about air quality during smoke from wildfires. So if you're curious and you want to learn more about air quality, or just want to keep an eye out for what is the air quality condition in your region, EPA has standards and have a very nice website. You can use your QR code to find this website, but basically it's a website where you go in and add your zip code or your city, town, state, and that will give you what's the air quality condition in your location at the moment, and also has a little forecast for the next few hours or days. So if you go there and type in your zip code, you should be able to get the real-time information for the air quality at your location. Now in your phone, you can also you can download an app for that, or most of the weather apps give you the air quality condition as with other environmental variables that you might be interested. So when we think about the air quality index that is created by the EPA, they actually have the air quality index for 5 major pollutants. So we have ozone, PM 2.5 and PM 10, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen dioxide. And basically, they create this very nice color code table here that guides us on the air quality, on the quality situation of air. So if we have air quality as green, it means that air quality is good. And as we keep going down, the air quality starts to decrease. So for example, the higher AQA value means the greater level of pollution is in the air. So for example, an AQA value of 50 or below is good, while an AQA value of over 300, like we see here on the maroon color, means we have hazardous air quality, okay? And I would like to point out that specifically for PM 2.5, there was an update on the threshold level. So it's likely that we're gonna see this coming year. If you look up on your app or on the website, AirNow website, we might see a little bit more moderate days when we think about air quality for PM 2.5 specifically, because there was a change on the threshold for those values. So till the beginning of this year in February, air quality value that we characterize as good, the AQI breaking point was from 0 to 12 micrograms per cubic meter. That number now changed from 0 to 9. So it means that we might be seeing a little bit more moderate air quality condition over the days over the year, simply because of that change. So it's also important to think that whenever air quality is good, it is good, and we don't have to worry much about being outside. But as air quality decreases, or as our AQI increases, like the number, we need to start making some changes in our plans. So avoiding being outside, avoiding being working out for too long, avoid intensive outdoor activities, consider to reschedule. And maybe if we get to the level where we have hazards air quality condition, you should maybe start thinking about creating a clean air room in your house, simply because it's hard to predict it for how long that will stay there, how long that air quality will be that poor, okay? I think AirNow and APA has suggestions on how to create that clean air room. So if you go to their website, you should find that information too. But basically, what you're looking for is just something that can filter the air and make it a little bit cleaner in a specific area in your house. So that was the very brief introduction I have for air quality, smoke, and fires. We're now gonna get into the research update for beef. And before I continue, I have to say that we have 2 research trials that we want to share with you guys today. It's preliminary data for both. One of the research, we have a little bit more, which is our natural smoke exposure study. And then we have the controlled control smoke exposure trial, where we have a little bit less data to show, but I think those are very relevant anyway. So for our very first study, what we call the natural smoke exposure study, I really have to thank you the Oregon Dairy Farmer Association for the support. They sponsored this study, so I'm really helpful and grateful for their support. Also, Mary and Jason, this study was conducted in a commercial farm, so I'm really glad they supported us and allowed us to conduct this study at their farm. So thank you very much one more time. So very briefly, the hypothesis of this study was basically that cattle naturally exposed to wildfire smoke, where air quality is reduced, will develop an inflammatory response which could negatively impact production. We know that to develop this immune response, animals will be using energy that could be partitioned to other metabolic process, so growth, reproduction, milk production. So whenever they are developing this immune response, it's likely that they are diverting energy from their metabolism, right? So we likely could see negative impact in production. And the objective of this study was to characterize those changes in blood markers associated with inflammatory response during and after wildfire smoke exposure and the subsequent performance of cattle. Okay, so as I mentioned, this study was conducted in a commercial farm. So we had 18 beef on dairy calves that were enrolled in this study. They were all individually housed in these hutches here. They were involved in study within a few days after being born. And for quite a bit of the study, they were individually housed, and they were group house with similar age calves. So throughout the study, we collect multiple variables, but primarily health scores and blood samples to look at those inflammatory markers. And basically what we did, we had a baseline sample. So we have samples from June to August that we call baseline. Then we had samples that we collected during smoke exposure. I'm sorry, not fire, smoke exposure. And then we collect some samples after smoke exposure. We also collect air data, so air quality data over time for the duration of the study from the AirNow database. And for this study particularly, we consider calf our experimental unit because simply what we were doing was looking at changes in metabolic markers over time prior to being exposed to smoke, during exposure, and after that exposure. So to make things a little bit simpler and more visual, I have a timeline for this study here. And so as per Forest Service, fire season begins in July 5th, so right after 4th of July. So we have here on the timeline the fire season. So our baseline, we have three collection days where we collect samples prior to any fire happen. So we had 3 collections which were basically a month apart. So we were collecting blood samples from those calves, health scores from those calves, air quality throughout the study, right? And then we wait for a fire to happen. And in this specific location, we had a fire that happened in September. Then we have one collection that was really immediately after smoke exposure. And then we had 3 other collections that were basically a week apart after calves had been exposed to smoke. So let's move into the results here very briefly. This is what we have for air quality for the duration of this study. I know this graph is a little bit busy, but basically what we're looking at here is the air quality from AirNow database from June to October of 2022. In our study location, we had a fire that happened near Vail, about 10 miles from the study location, that burned about 4,000 acres over 3 days. And as we can see here, I have a little flame here indicating the time of the fire. And as we can see, the air quality at that location increased over time as soon as we had the fire. So on the red dotted here, we have the EPA threshold. The older threshold was 35. So, I mean, it's still, but we would be in moderate at this point, air quality. So we can clearly see that we had at least 3 days of poor air quality, or air quality that was above than the recommended EPA standard for good air quality, right? So from June to beginning of September, June to August, the air quality or PM 2.5 was on average 5, so it was very, very, very good, very healthy air quality. And then when we had this fire happening in September, we saw an average of PM 2.5 of almost 45 micrograms per cubic meter over those 3 days, immediately after this fire happened, right? After the fire had been contained, air quality improved again, going back to approximately 8 for the duration of those collections. So all this to say that we had poor air quality, animals were exposed to smoke during the study. Right, so one of the first samples we look at on those calves that we collect and analyze from the blood from those calves, it's cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone, so anything that's stressful to those calves will tend to increase the cortisol levels on the blood of those animals. So as we can see here, on our baseline samples, there was no differences on the cortisol level of the plasma samples of those cows prior to fire. So all those 3 samples here in June, July, and August were similar. As soon as we had a fire, the sample we collect immediately after smoke exposure, we see an increase in cortisol level of those calves, which then starts to decrease again within on the weeks after the smoke exposure. But what I think it's really interesting on this data set is that during the time of the trial, prior to our last sample here in October, the calves were weaned maybe 1 or 2 days before our last sampling. And we know that weaning is very stressful for calves. It's an essential management practice, but it is stressful for the calves and is known to be probably the most stressful management practice for calves. And that tends to increase their cortisol levels. And as we can see by the data set here, the cortisol levels of calves right after being exposed to smoke is very similar to the cortisol levels of calves a few days after being weaned. So the smoke exposure seems to be as stressful as it is to calves when they are weaned. So we also look at ceruloplasmin concentrations on the blood of these calves, and ceruloplasmin, it is an inflammatory marker, so it's acute phase protein that tends to increase. So it's a positive acute phase proteins. It tends to increase whenever there's a stressor, there's a disease, or whenever the calves are in challenging situations, right? So similarly to what we saw for cortisol, there was no differences on the first 3 samples we collect during our baseline. They were very similar in values. Then we had a fire happening. Calves were exposed to smoke. Right after smoke exposure, we've seen that ceruloplasmin concentration in the blood to go up, which goes up to the 3rd collection after smoke exposure. Different from cortisol, ceruloplasmin tends to go up, but it's a little bit slower how this proteins build up in the blood. So this pattern of increase is very, it's what we were expecting to see. So there is an increase immediately after fire, but it continues to increase over time after being exposed to the smoke. Also with haptoglobin is also an inflammatory marker. It's also an acute phase protein that tends to increase during disease and during stressful situations. So we've seen somewhat similar response here. Again, no differences on those blood concentrations, haptoglobin concentration during the baseline. As soon as animals are exposed to smoke, we don't see that increase right after, but again, similar to ceruloplasmin, this is a response that's a little bit delayed, and we see that increase a little later. It could, and in this case, actually, it could have been compounded by the weaning happening in October, but we're seeing a little bit increase over time after animals have been exposed to that smoke. We also look at immunoglobulins simply because those are also involved in immune response. And we have compound samples for prior to fire, during fire, and after they've been exposed to fire. We purposely selected immunoglobulin A because it plays a important role in mucosal homeostasis. One of the things we're concerned whenever calves are exposed, cattle in general, exposed to smoke from wildfires, is drying of the lung and the airways. So I thought it would be important to look at that specific IgA because of its component, its importance in mucosa homeostasis. So we look at that specific immunoglobulin prior, during, and after smoke exposure. And as we can clearly see here, those levels increased over time and peaked after animals had been exposed to smoke. We see a similar response, not so dramatic for IgM too. So being exposed to smoke seems to be not harmful for the immune system, but seems to be leading to immune response whenever calves are exposed to that smoke. So what I want to highlight here before I start talking about our next project is that working with fire and smoke in the research setting is really challenging. So for all this data that I show so far, we actually had 3 sentinel herds all over the state. So we had animals that were enrolled in the study in Corvallis. We had animals that were enrolled in the study here in Barnes. And we also had animals that were enrolled in Vail, because we simply don't know when a fire is going to happen and where that's going to happen. So we had to be collecting baseline samples throughout the state in hopes, of course, we don't hope a fire is going to happen, but in that case, we were hoping for it so we could collect those samples and understand how that smoke exposure affects animal immunity, animal production, and everything. But out of those 3 cohorts we had for this study, we were only able to collect the full data set from one of those locations. And my point here is just to tell you guys that's very challenging to do this type of research. But we were really fortunate, and part of this grant here, part of this webinar series you're seeing, it's part of a larger USDA NIFA funded grant. And on the part of the research side of this grant, we have been working with controlled smoke exposure. So what we're doing now, and I'll show a little bit about it, is that we're mimicking smoke from wildfires inside of a barn so we can list on the particular matter PM 2.5 level represent what we are seeing during wildfires. So in this study here, we had 8 Angus Hereford heifers that were weaned maybe a month or so after weaned. We want to remove all effects of weaning on this study here, so we wait a little bit to start the study. Animals were acclimated to the barn, and they were in the barn for about 36 days. We had 7 days of acclimation, as you guys can see on the study timeline here. So day -7 to day 0 is our acclimation period. Then we had calves being exposed to smoke daily for 7 days. And then we follow up and continue to evaluate those animals without any smoke for about 3 weeks after we end the smoke exposure. So heifers were individually fed, hay and feed intake was recorded daily. We had health scores that were collected daily. We collect blood samples weekly to evaluate those same markers that we saw for the natural exposed animals. And we were also recording behavior of those animals 24/7 to understand how they behave when they are in a situation where they're being exposed to that smoke. So very briefly, I'm going to show you guys. This is our barn. I hope you guys can see this video. This is our heifers on the study. They were individually fed. They were individually, each one had one individual pen. So we're using calves that are as our individual experimental unit. Again, we're looking at changes over time, not necessarily a study that adds a treatment. And then we create our smoke. So this is a video of one of the smokes. So we did multiple smoking trials to come up with a level that is acceptable, that's representative of what we see naturally. And when I'm saying what is representative to what we see naturally, we're simply talking about particular matter 2.5. Like I said earlier, smoke from wildfires can be very complex, and we're only interested in trying to mimic the PM 2.5, not necessarily the chemical characteristics of that smoke. So on the next one, I can show to you guys. It is the barn with the heifers after they had been smoked. This is the morning after one of the smoke events. You guys, if you really pay attention on the last video here, you should be able to see some of the heifers in the pen. So this is basically what we did with those heifers. And now very quickly moving to the results. As we can see here, we have the air quality data over the weeks in the first year of the study. I forgot to mention this. This is a 3-year study. Last year was our very first year. And we're still gonna continue to do this study this year and next year. And then the one of the data that I wanna share with you guys is the air quality during the study, and specifically PM 2.5. So as we can see here, the air quality, PM 2.5 quantity over baseline and post-smoke exposure, it's very low. It's within the threshold we would expect it to be. But when we look at the air quality during smoke exposure, we see that we were very successful in increasing that air quality. I mean, decreasing the air quality, increasing the concentration of PM 2.5. I think on average, we were very close to 150 micrograms per cubic meter over the week. So we really represented in terms of PM 2.5, what we're seeing in natural conditions. We also started looking at the blood samples we collect from those animals, and very similar to what we're seeing for ceruloplasmin concentration on the blood of calves in our naturally exposed trial, we've seen again for these heifers, the heifers that were in the controlled smoke exposure study. So as we can see here from the -7 to 0, which was our acclimation phase, we don't see any changes in the ceruloplasmin concentration in the blood. But as soon as we start to expose those animals to smoke, we see an increase on ceruloplasmin concentration. So from day 0 to day 7, which is exactly the period that they were exposed to smoke, we see this increase in ceruloplasmin concentration, which remains elevated to up to day 14 or 7 days after they've been exposed to that smoke, and then it starts to decrease over time. So on the second study, it really had only those 2 slides to share, but summarizing the data so far, I think we've been able to show that smoke exposure from wildfires affects the well-being of cattle, leading to increase in blood cortisol concentration. We saw that on the naturally exposed animals. It seems also that exposure induces an inflammatory and humoral response, which has been observed with increase in acute phase proteins and immunoglobulins, that we saw in the naturally and controlled studies. I also think that we were very successful in developing this controlled environment, and seems to be fairly representative to natural conditions when we consider PM 2.5. So we are being successful in creating that smoke and making it more an environment that's more controlled for us to study this topic. An initial data analysis of the physiological markers of those animals in the controlled smoke trial seems to agree with the data from the naturally exposed animals. So I'm really hopeful that this initial steps toward this topic using the controlled smoke will help us to advance the research in this area. So that's basically what I had for tonight. So I'll stop sharing my slides and I'll let Jenifer start sharing on her side, and she'll continue this presentation. Jenifer, if you wanna go ahead.
Yep, just clicking
Okay.
to get stuff started. Come on. Is that giving you the appropriate view?
No, I don't think you're
Um,
sharing anything at this point. Sorry.
okay, all right, hang on.
Mhm.
Uh, all right, how about that?
I see your slides, but not yet. Let's see. There we go. All good.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So the remainder of today's webinar is going to be talking about how to prepare for wildfire, whether that's like the fire itself or whether it's smoke, when one is taking care of livestock. So the kind of main key point is, and if you saw Katie Wolstein's talk yesterday, it's really about preparedness and planning. And every operation is different. So you can certainly take guidance from other plans from other operations, but you really need to kind of make your own plan that's detailed and specific to your operation. So probably we could think about step one is just making sure to stay informed. So there's multiple places one can get information. So that may, depending on where you're located, there could be city emergency services. There will be county emergency services, and they typically have websites. There's also social media that may be helpful. Local news or radio also can provide updates. There should be an option to opt in for emergency alerts from your county, from the emergency services folks in your county. And you can also enable wireless emergency alerts on your phone. So this will give you a sound to get your attention and then have information that may be very, very pertinent. You do, of course, want to keep your cell phone charged. And then again, kind of be thinking about an emergency plan, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So in terms of planning, kind of starts out with thinking first and maybe sketching some stuff out. And good to have conversations with family members, if you have a larger operation, with maybe employees as well. To start having conversations and sort of gaming out what your response is going to be if wildfire is headed towards your place. So the first one is thinking about, should you evacuate your livestock? And this can depend on the numbers that you have. This can depend on the species that you have. It could depend on your location and what resources you may have available to actually move those animals to another location. And so some animals, it may be better to leave them to shelter in place. Others that you may want to evacuate. Or if you've got a smaller operation, maybe you can evacuate all of them. So if you've decided that you are going to evacuate in the event of an emergency, you need to know where you're going to go. So in your planning process is, what are good options for you? And we've got some over here listed in the box of places that one can consider. So friends' places, of course, would be pretty high up on the list. Of course, they also need to be outside of the danger zone, outside of evacuation areas, because you don't want to have to be moving twice if you can avoid that at all. Fairgrounds can be a really good option because they've got facilities for livestock, already set up. There's possibility for university facilities if those are in a good location relative to you. Racetracks, showgrounds, stables, equestrian centers, stockyards also have places for livestock. So identify at least 2 or 3 locations that may work for your livestock. And then the third really key point is, how will you transport your herd? What resources do you have available to move them? Do you have a livestock trailer? Would you have to borrow one? You know, how many head can you fit into that trailer? And making sure that you've got a vehicle that can pull that trailer. So we can think about step 3 is creating resources that are again relevant to your location. So it's really helpful to make a map, and this can be just going to Google Earth and downloading the satellite view of your farm or your ranch. And then actually kind of drawing on that. So identifying buildings, do they house animals? Do they house animals at particular times of the year that may change? So you could maybe have a map that, like, here's our June map and our June and July map, and it's different from our August and September map. So that can be really helpful, both in your own planning, but then also if you need to hand this map to someone who's going to help you, who maybe isn't as familiar with your place, so that you can show them on a map, where they need to go in order to provide assistance. Likewise, you can hand that to emergency responders as well. It can be really helpful. So note buildings, lanes, access routes, what's the best way in and out of your property, animal locations. And again, if that changes during the year, maybe making multiple maps that reflect those changes. Locations of fuels, chemicals, other hazards, again, may be really important for emergency responders. Likewise, where can water be accessed? The second major thing here is making a contact list of emergency phone numbers. And certainly it's good to have an electronic copy of that, but it's also really valuable to have a hard copy of that, multiple hard copies that are in different locations on your farm or ranch, in the office, in the house, in the barn, and maybe have some extras, again, that you may need to hand off to somebody because it may be helpful for them as well. And you want to, when you're building your list of emergency contacts, you're also kind of thinking about what your support system looks like. So who can help you in this situation? So that may be neighbors, that may be friends, that may be emergency responders in your local area, such as members of the fire department. And talk to these people about what your tentative plan is. So if you do if you need to ask for help because wildfire is coming, this isn't the first time that you've talked about this. This is something that you've already had a conversation about. And also, likewise, coordinate plans with your neighbors, because you're not evacuating in isolation in this instance. Your neighbors are also going to be evacuating at the same time. So it'd be really good to coordinate your plans with your neighbors. And even optimal, maybe having sort of a neighborhood evacuation plan that has been discussed and sorted out and then can be enacted when the time comes. So, of course, we're talking about livestock here, so we need to plan for their needs as well. And in the planning process is like thinking about how much time it's going to take to gather those individual animals up and to transport them. How many different species are you talking about? How can they be grouped? Do we need to keep bulls / rams / bucks away from your females? So think about how you're going to partition those animals up if they're going to be evacuated. And also if some of them are going to shelter in place. You want to calculate how much feed and water those animals are going to require for 7 to 10 days, both at the evacuation site or if they're going to stay. If you're evacuating in that location, you want to make sure that you've identified people who are going to help with animal care in case you are unable to be there because you've got responsibilities elsewhere. And it may be the case that some animals go to one location and other animals go to a second location. Our dairy animals that are lactating are kind of a special case because their needs are kind of up a level because we have milking that needs to be done every day. If animals are really late in their lactation, you can consider drying them off early. Moving them to a low quality feed can help with that process of getting them dried off. Again, this is if you've got, some advance notice. Is if you are evacuating lactating animals in that evacuation site, are you going to be able to milk them? And again, this question depends a lot on the number of lactating animals that you have. If it's a few, like 5, you can hand milk them if you really have to. If we're talking larger numbers, which the vast majority of our dairy operations in the state are, relocating those animals in a timely fashion to a location where you can continue milking them, where you're going to have electricity and access to a milking parlor, that's a lot more challenging. And so we need to get back to that question of should they be evacuated or should there be plans made to have them shelter in place? Another thing to consider is alternative animal identification. So if your animals are going to be evacuated to a common site, such as a fairgrounds, where there's going to be a lot of other livestock kind of thrust together in one place, kind of all at once, you may want to mark your animals maybe with paint. So in a very consistent manner. So maybe you've decided, okay, I'm going to use blue paint and I'm going to put 2 dots, one over the top of each other on the left side, kind of right in the middle of the ribs, and mark all of your animals that way so that at a glance, if there's a whole bunch of livestock milling about and somebody did something silly at the fairgrounds and animals got mixed together, you can really, really easily be like, that one's mine, that one's mine, that one's mine. So think about some alternative identification that may be helpful for you in the evacuation scenario. And of course, you want to make sure that you've got animal records that are updated that you can get to easily. Ideally, you've got some photographs, particularly for your higher value animals or your more sort of individual animals, maybe horses, and also vaccination records. So in the event of actual evacuation, you do want to do that as early as possible, particularly if you've got a lot of animals to move. And you really want to try and do that during the daylight hours. Trying to do all of this when folks are stressed in the dark just makes everything so much harder. In addition, when you get to the evacuation site, you want it to be daylight there as well, so that when you're moving animals into a strange location, they can at least see where they're going, and that will, lessen their stress versus showing up in the dark. You do want to make sure that you're moving animals calmly using low stress handling techniques. It's an already stressful situation, so you don't want to make that any worse with yelling and any sort of abusive activities. So make sure that, if you need to, take a deep breath or 2 or 3. Maybe that's not such great advice if there's smoke everywhere. Okay, well, count to 10 if you find yourself getting upset, to kind of like bring the stress level back down, because that's going to be easier when you're moving animals around. If you've got help with other people transporting animals for you, particularly if you don't know them very well, make sure that you're taking photographs of like, okay, this load of animals is in that trailer, and you can just take a quick photo, or make sure you're making notes about which animals are going where and who is taking them. If you're going to shelter in place, if livestock, some number of them are going to be sheltering at their home location, you do want to identify where is the safest spot at your farm or ranch. So safer spots are going to be devoid of fuels. So if you've got a really heavily grazed pasture, that may be a good option. If you've got any irrigated space that's nice and green, that is going to be a really good option. Ideally, you want to be able to create a fire break around the barn or the pasture or wherever the animals are going to be located, to, again, minimize the chance that sparks will be able to come in and alight anything. You do want to leave enough food and water, ideally for at least 7 to 10 days. One of the things you want to make sure is that there's going to still be water available if their electricity fails, which is entirely possible in a wildfire situation. So you don't want to necessarily rely on the pump from your well to make sure that the animals have water. So you do want to fill up every container you've got, if that's what it takes, to make sure that they're going to have water going forward. You do want to leave internal gates open. If you've got any portable fencing, maybe reel that up so that the animals have as much space to move in as they can. You know, keep your perimeter fence, but ideally. But give them flexibility for them to keep themselves safe if fire does move through the area. And you do want to shut off propane and other fuels and to minimize those hazards. So once authorities permit your return to your operation, you should probably go and scope it out ahead of time before you actually bring a load of animals in. So you want to make sure that you've got feed and water that are not contaminated and are going to be available to your livestock in a familiar location. You want to check and make sure that any essential fences or other structures are intact and safe before you put animals back into those spaces. The worst case scenario is if you cannot return to your home place, is having a longer term plan. Like if returning back again, if bringing livestock back is not an option, do some thought exercises and exploring of what that might look like. If the fire blazes up really fast and the evacuation level jumps from 1, which is our get ready, and think about getting ready, to level 3, which is go right now, and you've got no time to evacuate the livestock. Again, you want to follow those, follow the guidelines for sheltering in place. So is move them to the safest location, make sure they've got food and water, leave gates open. Do you make sure that you've got updated animal records that you can take with you when you evacuate? And again, on returning back again, once authorities permit it, you do want to scope out and see what the situation is, locate any animals that may have wandered away. Any that you can't find, you want to report their, what species, how many of them, to local authorities, and also talk to your neighbors so that everyone can keep an eye out for those animals. And then when you do return and you're kind of assessing the condition of both facilities and the animals themselves, see what their condition is like. And if any of them got any sort of burns or significant actual physical harm, you do want to talk to your veterinarian about an animal health recovery plan. So briefly, you do want to triage injured animals. So severely burned animals will probably need to be euthanized. And burns can be kind of tricky to assess. So again, this is helpful if you've got the assistance of your veterinarian. You do want to follow guidelines closely and check their progress. So burns can actually keep getting worse after the initial injury. You also want to keep an eye out for pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs. And this can come from having inhaled hot gases and can do some damage to the lungs. And of course, you're always going to be keeping track of how much your animals are eating. So if they're going off feed, that can be certainly an indicator they're not doing well. Injury from burns is possible. So this is an example of a cow that did receive some significant burns and did recover. In the event that you experience animal or crop losses, you do want to take pictures of the dead livestock where they lie before doing anything with the carcasses, and you don't want to document where those locations are and where they were found. You can do that by, again, with pictures and making notes. Similarly with crop losses. So there is federal assistance available from several different programs, and all of them include wildfire as one of the eligible types of disaster. So there may be the potential to be get some reimbursement for those losses experienced during wildfire. And if you do have deaths resulting from a wildfire incident, that is, of course, really unfortunate from multiple perspectives, but you do want to make sure that you dispose of those carcasses responsibly. So multiple options exist. There's burial, there's composting, there's taking to a landfill, and then there's also natural disposal, which is just leaving the carcasses out for scavengers. Now, which of these is an appropriate and legal option is going to depend on where you're located. And for this, I would certainly advise checking out the Oregon Department of Agriculture's guidance on livestock carcass disposal, because it does lay out which of these options is appropriate in which cases and sort of in which landscapes. And they also have a list of landfills that are authorized to take livestock carcasses. So in many cases, as Juliana alluded to earlier, we can get a lot of smoke and not actually be endangered by wildfire itself. So when we've got smoky days with poor air quality, that can affect animals' health. So we may observe the symptoms that are listed here, such as coughing and difficulty breathing, eye irritation and discharge from the eye. We may see nasal discharge. They may have an increased respiratory rate, and there may be seeming fatigue or weakness and potentially reduced appetite. But I do want to make the point that animals may show none of these signs and still be experiencing stress from smoke. And I'd say that you're actually probably not very likely to see these symptoms, and probably not the whole list, even when the air quality is pretty bad. So during smoky days, you want to be monitoring animal health a little more closely than you do during good weather and good air quality times. Again, you can keep track of how well they're eating. Going off feed is typically an indication of poor health for one reason or another. In this case, it could be because of the poor air quality. If you've got young animals, there is this calf health scoring chart from the University of Wisconsin that can be really helpful for assigning kind of a numerical score, makes it a little bit more objective when identifying how calves are feeling. When it is smoky, you do want to minimize how much animals are moving around. So like ourselves, if they are expending a lot more energy, if they are running, they're going to be breathing a lot harder. And every respiration, every inhalation, they're going to be bringing particulate matter into their lungs. So we do want to keep animals as quiet as possible and minimize how much activity they're experiencing. Likewise, we don't want to add on additional stressors. So that smoke exposure is stressing their system, as we've seen from the research data, both today and on Monday's webinar. So if we can postpone any additional stressful activities, that's a good idea. So things like weaning and vaccination and processing calves, changing groups, which brings about social stress, transporting animals, all of these things are additional stressors. So if we can put that off until the air quality improves, that's what we want to do. With our wildfire, it's typically occurring when we've also got high temperatures. So heat stress, also something that we want to avoid. But again, we don't want to stack any more stressors on the smoke that's already there. So if we can reduce heat stress via shade, if we've got fans, if we've got misters, those are all good options for reducing heat stress. Fresh water, of course, that's always an important thing to have available to all your animals. But it's even more important when we've got wildfire smoke. Because when we've got adequate water intake, that keeps the airways moist. And that helps clear particles, all that junk that they're inhaling. If we've got plenty of water intake and everybody's well hydrated, that helps them remove all those particulate matter back out of their airways. Additionally, if the airways are dried out, so in an animal that's a little bit dehydrated, that actually can worsen the effects of that particulate matter in irritating the respiratory tissue, and also provide opportunities for opportunistic infections by bacteria. And we definitely don't want that. Additionally, if we can limit dust exposure by choosing low or dust-free feeds, and if we do have kind of some dust coming up, watering that down in facilities along roadways that are near where animals are spending time to reduce general dust in the area. So in summary, prepare, think about it ahead of time. Actually make a written plan because that's will serve you well should an emergency arise. You do, in the case where we've got smoke, limiting animal exercise, minimizing other stressors, making sure we've got plenty of water, and work with your veterinarian if you do need to develop a health recovery plan if you've got animals that have been injured or otherwise really affected by wildfire. All right, and that wraps us up for today. If anybody's got any questions, be happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Jenifer. Thank you very much for covering that portion. I do think we have a few questions on the quick Q&A box. Do you want to read those and we answer it together? Probably better reading than I am.
All right, so our first question, what strategies can be implemented to minimize the impact of wildfire smoke on animal performance and health?
Yeah, that's a good one. I would say, I mean, you just touched on that one a little bit on trying to not stack stressors during those conditions, right? So I think that's the main one we should be looking into right now. If you're thinking about weaning, maybe postpone a little bit. If you're gonna commingle animals, maybe postpone that to vaccination. Probably not gonna be effective when those animals have elevated immune response already going on. And also on the side of nutrition and management, I think that's where we want to go with studies. We want to be looking into things we can do to improve the environment of those animals. Maybe something we can do to clean the air in specific locations if they're in the barn, or maybe there's a supplement that we can add to the water, to the feed. So we're very interested in looking into hydration supplements, so electrolytes, betaine, that keep those airways probably more moist during smoke exposure, but that we don't have the data for that yet. It's just something we would like to be looking into in the future. But basically, I think it's trying to minimize stress. I don't know, Jenifer, do you want to add some, maybe on the dairy side?
No, and I think you've kind of hit on it where that's certainly areas of active research currently, and then also looking forward is when we've a lot of these studies are looking at better understanding the physiology, how the physiology of the animal changes when it's exposed to smoke, and hopefully with that understanding, that'll also lead us towards some potential mitigation techniques that may be able to help at a physiological level beyond, let's keep them quiet and minimize stressors.
Wow, that's very good.
All right, second question. I appreciate the federal government's support of loss of life assistance, but what about economic losses from reduced milk production, reduced birth weight, etc.? Yeah, that is a good question. And I don't believe that is available. I think the bulk of it is loss, although is actual death losses.
Yeah. Yes,
But I would, yeah,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just thinking, so the links are provided, and again, when the recording becomes available, those resources will be listed. I don't believe any of them cover losses beyond death or less than death. But I'd have to do a deeper dive into
Yeah.
those programs.
Yeah, so at this point, I think I'm on the same page as you. I don't think any of the programs will cover like, well, I had reduced milk production or my calves were lighter, I lost more animal. I mean, for animals lost, yes, but I got more animals that got sick because of opportunistic disease. So I don't think we have any programs at that level at this point. As we talked earlier, this is very beginning of a research area. There's not a lot of information for livestock at this point right now. But I think that moving forward, whenever we have more opportunities to document those losses and attribute those losses to smoke exposure, maybe in the future we're gonna be better positioned to make those claims. So I don't know if you guys are following the news with the wine industry and vineyards in Oregon. I think they're gonna be receiving a settlement from the 2020 wildfires where they lost production. So maybe we could go in a path that's similar. So I think in a few years we might be able to document those losses and make sure we can confirm that those losses in production are related to smoke exposure. So we're just starting this, but I feel like we have a great path to go and get to that point. Any other to add in there, Jenifer?
No, I think that kind of covers it. So third question, if livestock seem to be unaffected or unharmed by the fire or smoke, would it still be a good idea to have it checked out by a veterinarian, and what are some signs we can look out for? So I think, so again, the looking for signs of ill health, like going off feed, so not eating.
Mm-hmm.
Looking for nasal discharge, eye discharge, behavioral changes in the animal. I think looking for those signs that are more obvious of ill health, at that point, that may be worth a phone call to your veterinarian. But I think if they're not showing outward signs, I don't think that requires veterinary attention. If the appetite is good, if the behavior is good, if eyes and noses are clear, um, I don't think that would be particularly helpful. So I think if you want to make sure you've got some recovery time, because as we've seen, we still see some stress response after the smoke exposure, is if you want to stretch out that period of kind of lower activity and minimizing other stressors, that can go beyond the period of like the air is cleared up, and maybe give them another week or 10 days of quiet activity, and minimizing other stressors, to give them a little bit more recovery time if you're worried.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. Animals tend to be very good at hiding sickness and disease. So even though sometimes they're not showing anything, but I think feeding is one of the main things. If you have a way to be looking at, and not everybody has a feed bank. Most of the animals will be grazing in the beef side, so it's hard to quantify that. But if you have opportunities to track those feeding habits, that might tell you quite a bit on what's going on. So if we see those feeding habits going down, not animals are not eating, then maybe it's worth to bring a veterinarian. But other than that, I would not worry so much. If they're, like you said, they're not showing any, they're not coughing, they don't have any runny eyes, runny nose, and things like that. So it might be little bit more challenge for them to come up with a diagnostic for those animals. But if you suspect of something, then always welcome and always smart to bring the veterinarian in. Okay, I think that's what we have for tonight. I don't see any other questions, so I guess we conclude the second edition of this webinar series tonight. All the talks were recorded. We should have those available anytime next week, hopefully. They're gonna be online on our website, so make sure to check out if you missed any of the other nights or if you wanna revisit some of the information. We also have the recordings from last year if you wanna look at that information from the previous year. So I think that's it. Keep an eye out for an email from me about the recordings, the survey of our webinars. And I think that's what we had. Thank you very much for being here with us tonight. And I hope to see you next year. Good night.